Board of Selectmen. Florence, your support and attendance at many of the Chatham 300 events, including this one, is most appreciated. You have been to so many of the events, and we certainly appreciate all of that. And we also enjoyed your introductory comments, and it sets the stage for everything that follows.
Thanks. Thank you, Ron. As Ron has noted, as Chair of the Board of Selectmen, I've had the distinct pleasure of introducing several of the Chatham 300 events since March. But as John Whalen noted, and those of you who read the Chronicle this week may have read his column. If you didn't, you should. And he notes that it didn't seem that the committee could keep coming up with events, activities, and talks, but they have. And they've used this year to celebrate every conceivable aspect of life in Chatham. Today is no different, as the clergy have come together to talk about the topic 300 years of religion at the elbow. Actually, it's a celebration of more than 300 years, because we'll start today with the Wampanoag religion, and the people of the First Light were here long before William Nickerson came, and their religion based on spiritualism and oneness with all living creatures of the earth is part of the story. As we know, William Nickerson came to these shores because he chafed at the strictures of the Crown Colony and the Church of England. He built his house in Chatham in 1664, and I'm sure it will be noted, but initially the Nickerson family, they had to find government representation, and they did in Eastham, but that was 7 or 8 miles away, which it was a 5-hour horseback or ox cart ride away. So they petitioned the court for separation, and it was agreed to, but they had to meet the conditions of putting money aside to house a minister and build the meeting house. And finally, we get to 1711, when they wanted to incorporate as a town, but they had to meet the conditions of the crown at the time, which required a church, a parsonage, and a hired preacher. At that time, you couldn't have a town without a standing order church, and the Congregational Church, as I'm sure you will hear, was the standing order church. So I'm sure the history of the present day churches will be well told today. But I do finally want to thank the clergy on behalf of all of us in the town for the wonderful gift that they gave to the town in honor of the 300th celebration, which is a labyrinth on Chatham Place. A place for quiet meditation and reflection for people of all faiths and all beliefs. So thank you.
At this point, it's not right on your program, but we've intended to have a slideshow, the first half of the slideshow that's prepared by Nancy Bischoff of the historical churches of the town.
And actually this was playing as many of you came in, but you were also chatting and spending
Florence said, we don't start our religious view with 300 years ago, because there was, for thousands of years before that, we had people living this. And to tell us about that, we have Todd Kelly, who has made the Wampanoag one of his studies.
Thank you. I was encouraged, or we were encouraged, to write out our programs and stick to the script. So I apologize if I tend to read this more than actually engaging you in conversation in order to stick with the script. There are many points in this that really deserve more commentary that we just don't have the time for. So my program is entitled First Peoples Religion at Monomoy Territory. And firstly, though I am speaking in general about the Wampanoag people or Wampanoag religion, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Wampanoag people today. It's not my place to do that. However, as a native son of this town, I do have the authority to speak about the convictions that were instilled in me growing up here by this community and by the legacy of the Monomoy people themselves and the spiritual understandings that govern this land. To begin with, and for historical reference, the Mashpee Meeting House was built in 1684 under the leadership of Richard Bourne and Thomas Tupper, and was originally located at Bryant's Neck along Santua Pond. Bryant's Neck is Solomon Bryant, who was an Indian preacher. Santua Pond is actually Mashpee, but the eastern edge of it is the town of Barnstable. That's Newtown Santua Road. And it was, excuse me, in Santua Pond, excuse me, it was a cool water place. It was moved to its present location in 1717, and at which time it was remodeled into the meeting house that you see today. It is a Christian meeting house and with Christian-based services that are conducted by the Wampanoag pastor, Christian Fry Jr., and I believe those services are open to the public today. Many of the people don't abide by traditional Indian ways today. They do attend mostly the Baptist church in Mashpee as a point of reference. However, now, the Monomoy Meeting House was built around 1691, and you may not even be aware that such a place was built. But it was along the present-day Old Queen Anne Road, just after the dirt road, access road to Goose Pond, right across from the head of the Monomoy River, Muddy Creek. And that was under the leadership of the parson, Samuel Treat. He was based at Eastham and was well respected by the native people of the Lower Cape. The Monomoy minister here was Tom Cussons, and Tom Cussons was actually raised at the lighthouse area. That was his mother's property. She was the daughter, one of the daughters of Metaquasan, and before it got bogged down into title searches of property, he set aside property for his 3 daughters, and he had a son as well. And one of that was right at the lighthouse. And he would have given Christian-based services under the guidance of Parson Treat. And the interesting thing is that those would have been given in the native dialect. Those were not being spoken in English. However, this meeting house was abandoned sometime after Samuel Treat died in the Great Snow of 1717. These meeting houses, and especially the Mashpee Meeting House today, are the spiritual and tangible embodiment of the story of two cultures, and the earnest desire of a primitive people in their efforts to adopt and live in an advanced culture that was so suddenly presented to them. That's a quote. That is a formal letter written by Delsina Hendricks. This was for the rededication of the Mashpee Meeting House, and this was in 1970. And that's a real poignant spot there, because with that in mind, the spiritual and tangible embodiment of the story of two cultures, when you go over the canal, think of the two bridges. They themselves carry separate names, 2 separate names that are a testimony to this story of two cultures. Richard Bourne, the Christian missionary, and with the Bourne Bridge, and then the Sagamore Bridge, acknowledging the ancient unbroken lineages of spiritual knowledge and wisdom of the first people. The term Sagamore, which generally means chief, literally means he has mastery of. And the term chief, we generally don't have a lot of respect for. Sometimes we might, but we kind of mock it. When you think of he has mastery of, now you start to think of doctor, scholar, and that we might have more respect, more genuine respect for. And that's what the term Sagamore really means. So you might consider that when you cross those bridges. A Sagamore or sachem had the social responsibility of looking after and through redistribution when necessary, ensuring the welfare of the entire community. By the mid-1600s, Mataquasan of Monomoyet had emerged as the old Sagamore and was the only one who still remained on Cape Cod, acknowledged as a Sagamore amongst the native people. This is a significant historical fact worthy of deeper consideration and commentary, because that's among the native people themselves. They did not identify or refer to anyone, even on the other side of the canal in the general area, because the canal wasn't there, as Sagamore. So that's telling us something very significant. In regard to religion, an Indian traditionalist considers the earth the center of the existence and balance, and for everything taken, something must be returned. It is the job of the Indian medicine people to maintain this equilibrium. They guide their followers to recognize and participate in what might be termed the essence of existence, the medicine circle. Everything in creation is part of that circle. Continuous from birth to death, everything springs from the earth and is returned in a timeless cycle. The medicine circle is the source of the Indian strength. That's quoted from Russell M. Peters in his book, The Wampanoags of Mashpee, 1989. And Russell Peters continues with, the medicine man is not concerned with physical cures. He is more involved with spiritual matters. He is the spiritual leader of the tribe. And now I explain that at the time of European contact, however, the term tribe that we understand today would be more synonymous with community. And I will elaborate on that. It is important to understand that the first people of North America were made up of thousands of communities of diverse ethnicity that had their own customs and beliefs. It is through the commonality of region, kinship, and language base that communities shared customs and beliefs through the oral tradition and became thought of as tribes. So here is Monomoyet. The oral tradition is not only the art of telling stories related to centuries of learned knowledge, spiritual understanding, and collective communal experience, it is also the art of listening. This is a universal custom amongst the first people. That is to say that when someone is speaking, you do not interrupt them until they are completely finished with what they have to say. And after they are finished, what has been said is either thought about, and then maybe even counsel is held before any response is given. Respect is always given to others' perspectives, even if there is disagreement. So the two salient points to contemplate here are my direct, ongoing, spiritual, physical, ecological, and social relationship to the land and community, that's spatial ecology, and language itself and how I use it. Within the native dialects, the words themselves come from the land. They describe the land, my relation to it, as well as relation to the natural world around me, whether animate or inanimate. How these words are spoken in regard to the attitude and intent behind their meaning is a fundamental philosophical and social difference between how we use language and how we hear or don't hear what others are saying. Today, our speech is often rooted in a need to deceive or manipulate. And more importantly, it's actually rooted in varying degrees of some form of self-deception and self-importance, which is in fact the bedrock of all of our individual and collective suffering. Divisive and deceptive speech that is pervasive in our society today is a spiritual and social poison. That has nothing to do with the freedom of speech. It has everything to do with the responsibility of speech. And last spring, in this very room, we were able to watch the movie We Still Live Here. That was about Jessie Little Doe Baird and the Wampanoag Language Recollection Program. This program is a demonstration of the people reclaiming their spiritual integrity, which is rooted in the language itself. This is why this program is held sacred and private, as it should be. It is for the spiritual health, welfare, and identity of the Wampanoag people today, and is consistent with their 7 Generations program of how actions taken today will affect the welfare of the next generations to follow, up through as far as 7 generations from now. And with us, it's pretty much, it's all about me. What's in it for me now? 7 generations from now. So to conclude, how we use language and our relationship to the land as temporary stewards is more in line with a reverent, communal, custodial function and not that of a self-serving dominion as we oftentimes see it. Conversely, that word dominion, domination, control, sovereignty, can have an alternate definition, which could be interpreted as a reverent, custodial responsibility and awareness of the profound impact that our attitudes and behavior directly have on the land and all living beings that inhabit it. For after all, and without a doubt, here where I stand is holy ground. Thank you.
So to get from the Wampanoag to the founding of the Congregational Church, it's my task to bridge this gap, and I'm going to take this history almost entirely from Chatham, W.C. Smith, first published in 1913. There were no permanent English settlements in this part of the Cape until William Nickerson moved here. Nickerson's dates are a bit muddy. There's a long legal case in which he had to bring clear the title of the lands he had brought from the natives. But he was apparently residing in Monomoyet, as this area was called, by 1664. However, the cloud over his land titles prevented him from selling to new settlers until the case was finally resolved. Remember that the motive for the settlers to leave England, both for the separatists of Plymouth Colony and the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay, was to allow them to worship God in their own way. But it was not an individual decision. There were tight social controls. And from the beginning, both colonies insisted that in order to start a town, you had to have a church. The idea was that when the size of your settlement reached 10 families, each family could tithe, and that is pay 1/10 of their income into a common treasury, and that would allow for the calling of a minister. And once you had called a minister, you could erect a meeting house, and once you had the minister in the meeting house, then and only then could you apply to the Great General Court to establish a town. The earliest decrees of the Plymouth Court put Monomoyet as a district of Yarmouth, and then two years later moved it to being a district of Eastham. The nearest church was in Eastham, as Florence was saying, and that was 7 miles distance over uncertain roads. So William Nickerson held services in his house. This may have satisfied the spiritual needs of the Monomoyet inhabitants, but they still had to pay tax money to support the Eastham minister. So they wished to get their own church and township. There was a lot of legal wrangling over this point. By 1679, the settlement had been recognized as a constabulary and was freed from paying taxes to Eastham, but it did not have enough settlers to attract an Orthodox minister. William Nickerson died himself in about 1690, about the same time that the Plymouth colony was merging with the Massachusetts Bay colony, and a new war started between the colonists and the Indians, this time with the French as allies of the Indians, of some of the Indians. Though there was never hostility between any of the Cape tribes and the English settlers, this state of war increased tensions and increased the burden of taxation and draft for military services. At this point, geographically located, the residents, the English residents of Chatham felt that they were very vulnerable to attack by French ships. Now, William Nickerson did not purchase all the lands of Monomoyet from the natives, and for generations, the settlers and natives lived side by side. From the 1680s on, there was a Christian ministry to the Native Americans. As you just heard, a meeting house was erected for their worship. In 1685, the number of praying Indians, so-called at Monomoyet, was put at 115. The Indians had a parallel government, which was in many ways more sophisticated than that of the settlers. In 1697, a Mr. Jonathan Vickery came to settle at Monomoyet. He was a lay preacher, neither educated nor ordained, as well as a fisherman. He had a place in Hull, but was induced to sell it and moved to Monomoyet full-time by the promise of a supply of hay and wood and a salary of 20 pounds per year. In 1700, acting under Mr. Vickery's influence, the town erected its first meeting house for the settlers. It was a common enterprise, with every man required to do his part. It took the better part of a year to finish the building this way, and when finished it was rough by today's standards, though the most imposing building in the settlement. No shingles, no clapboard, no glass upon the windows, no steeple or even portico outside, no pews inside except perhaps for the family of the minister. Rather long benches were arranged facing the pulpit on either side of the center aisle. It was used for all public meetings of the village, whether religious or secular. However, in 1702, Mr. Vickery was lost in a fishing accident at sea. Harwich, by this time, had been incorporated for more than a decade, and a dispute had arisen regarding a district which Harwich claimed as within its boundaries, but whose inhabitants thought they belonged to Monomoyet and therefore refused to pay taxes to Harwich. Monomoyet brought an action to the Great General Court asking it to resolve this boundary dispute. In 1703, this came on for a hearing, but it appeared that Monomoyet, having lost Mr. Vickery, had lost its standing with the legislature. By decree of November 18, 1703, the 6 families in the disputed area were ordered to pay their taxes to Harwich until, quote, there be a learned Orthodox minister settled at Monomoyet. For the next few years, the townspeople tried without success to settle a minister, but the outlook was not bright. The men were being impressed in the service in the Indian Wars, and the court had refused to extend the boundaries of the town. In 1711, 13 families emigrated from the village for one reason or another, most of them ending up in Delaware, leaving only 33 in the village. At this crucial juncture, Reverend Hugh Adams was induced to come to the Monomoyet. Now, I feel a certain kinship for this man. I am a second career minister, having been a lawyer in Charleston, South Carolina for 20 years before attending Harvard for my ministerial training. Mr. Adams was both a minister and a physician, and he graduated from Harvard in 1697 and then went to Charleston, South Carolina, where he tried to start several churches. He had some scrapes with creditors while he was there. He married a local girl, lost his mother, and moved back up to New England in 1706 to take a church in Braintree, where he was ordained. He had some trouble there about his salary and left to come to Monomoyet in 1711. He was apparently procured for the village by the Association of Ministers for the county, and he set right to work to try to ease the unsatisfactory conditions and stem the tide of immigration. He drew up a petition to exempt the people of Monomoyet from taxation and military service, to annex the disputed neighborhood, and to incorporate the town with a proper English name. The petition, in Adams's own hand, still survives today. It was signed at town meeting in June of 1711 and brought to Boston. At the same meeting, the village voted to accept Mr. Adams's proposal for his own settlement, being a salary and a chance to get some of his common lands. The Great General Court passed an order on October 19th asking Harwich to respond to the petition. Of course, it was going to be 6 months till the matter was decided, so Adams got the ear of the governor to issue an emergency order exempting the men of Monomoyet from military draft during that time, since the town felt vulnerable to invasion from the French ships. The matter came on for hearing in the legislature on June 7, 1712, and the House of Representatives issued a formal vote 2 days later rejecting the petition for incorporation. But some sort of deal was struck, for on June 11th, a short order issued granting incorporation of the town under the name Chatham, but not acting on any of the other matters raised in the petition. In the following years, Adams set about being both minister and doctor to the community, and at first things went along well. But when Adams set out to make a church within the congregation, the County Ministers Association said there was a cloud and they could not proceed. What this cloud is not clear. Adams also encountered trouble with the keeper of Chatham's Tavern, one Ebenezer Hawes. The tavern was near Adams's residence, and he could see what was going on there, and he did not approve. Taverns were licensed by the General Court on recommendation of the selectmen, and since Hawes was one of the selectmen, Adams had quite an uphill struggle. Then there were rumors floating around about what Adams had been doing in his years in Charleston. In the ensuing years, Adams tried earnestly to make a go of the church, but at one point in February 1715, he gave in to his frustrations and preached a sermon in which, in Mr. Smith's word, he handled those who differed with him without gloves. His congregants stopped coming to church. Mr. Hawes, who had been wrapped in the sermon, was highly offended and said there were 2 or 3 abominable lies in it, and Hawes repeated some of the rumors about Adams's character. Adams thereupon sued Hawes for slander. Now, suing someone for slander is always a risky business, for the party sued can defend by trying to prove that what he said was true, and if it succeeds, he cements that derogatory information in the public mind. The case came on in May of 1715 for trial, and some of Adams's parishioners became witnesses for Hawes. The trial court decided in Hawes' favor, and Hawes took delight in reading the testimonies of the witnesses aloud in his tavern. Adams was called on to resign but refused to do so. The town then refused to pay him further salary, so he asked that an ecclesiastical court be summoned consisting of ministers from 3 neighboring towns. This court met and decided that Hawes was in the right and sustained the town's refusal to pay further salary. Adams continued to litigate the matter for years, but at some point realized that the handwriting was on the wall and eventually left Cape Cod to practice ministry and medicine in New Hampshire the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And that way we take it up to Joe Marshall.
One of the great tragedies about our history is the parsonage burned down in 1861, and 150 years of important church and town records were lost in that moment. I often have thought as I stand in the sanctuary, if walls could only talk, we would hear great things from these sanctuary walls. But those sanctuary walls would not even go back far enough to the beginning of this church, because the sanctuary that you know of as the First Congregational Church only goes back to 1833. And as it's been pointed out by earlier speakers, as long as there have been settlers in this region, there has been people gathering in a meeting house of sort to worship, to pray, to read scripture. We think the first meeting house was built around 1690. There is a letter that indicates in 1693 that the meeting house was in need of some repair. This was probably just a very small place, but the second meeting house in the first real building was built in 1700. And it was 22 feet in length and was 440 square feet with a 13-foot high ceiling. And this was the building that really saw the beginning of Chatham, both in its town and in getting the First Congregational Church underway. Things were growing, as you've heard. People were coming, and so that meeting house had to be enlarged, and it was done so between 1729 and 1730, and there are sketches of this meeting house before and after, and they look exactly the same. And so what most likely happened, those of you who know West Parish and West Barnstable off of Exit 5, they would just cut the building in half, pull it apart, and fill in. It wasn't until 1773 that yet another addition or another enlargement was done to this meeting house, actually creating, if you see the sketch, what might look like as transepts. The third meeting house, which is in a sense the current building we're in, was built in 1833 in what is Union Cemetery. Now, there are some pictures, I'm told, of that building. I have not seen them, but this is a painting that was done of that meeting house that was built in 1833. Now, it looks just like the Congregational Church down the road. If you look closely, you'll notice one very interesting difference. There are 2 stairways and 2 doors. One stairway for the women and one stairway for the men. And that was changed in 1866 when, and I should tell you that in 1830 it was when the meeting house was built. It cost $2,920.77. That was the cost in 1830. About 30 years later, it was decided that the church would be better off in its mission and in its livelihood if it were nearer the downtown. And so in 1866, the building was moved from Union Cemetery to its present site. It was flaked, it was taken apart and reconstructed at the Rotary there. But I am told, although I have not seen it, if you go to Union Cemetery, the old foundation is still there where the church was built in 1830. But in 1866, at a cost of $8,000, the building was flaked and moved. And if you go up into the above the sanctuary in the attic, you can actually see they didn't put it back together exactly like they had taken it apart. You can see where new holes were bored and so forth. And that is the building that we now reside and call our church home. Now, you've heard a lot about some of these early colorful characters of the Congregational church, and the minister was very different in the perception that you might have of one of us today. I think it's different than what you have one of us today. But it's been written that towns had so few trained men that they could not afford, let's see here, blah, blah, blah. The minister was called upon not only as a physician for spiritual ills, but for physical ills as well. He not only preached on Sunday, but was called upon to prescribe in sickness, being supposed to have some knowledge of medicine, and he was further expected to know some law. He was oftentimes a preacher, pastor, doctor, surgeon, which is the most frightening of all, lawyer, and judge, all in one. The salary of the first minister, who you heard a little bit about, Mr. Jonathan Vickery, was paid in hay, provided by 6 different men who promised to bring it to his door. And that was very typical. The town provided for the minister, I think, until the Methodists came on the scene and sort of ruined all that for us. But in 1831, so a long time after these meeting houses are around, pews were finally installed in the newly built church, and they were sold at a public auction on February 10th, 1831. A new bell was added to the new steeple at this time. This is still the meeting house in Union Cemetery. I think I'm pointing the right way, aren't I? Yeah. And rang for services for more than 30 years until it was taken down, sent to Boston, refurbished, and brought back to its new home at the Rotary. On July 16th, 1887, lightning struck and damaged the steeple so severely that the church was deprived of it for some time. It had been a landmark for ships at sea during all the years of its life, and was finally put back together again. And in part, when it was put back, the spire at the top utilized part of the mast from the R.A. Allen, which had been wrecked out on Monomoy at that time. There was also no music. Well, there was music in the church, but only vocal music, no accompaniment. And it wasn't until the 1830s that it has been written a bass viol began to accompany the singing, and as Deacon Levi Atwood has written, that was probably all these sanctimonious worshipers could take at that time. It was a little later that the organ was introduced, and you saw some of those pictures of the early organs in the church. A couple of just things before I finish up. We have some wonderful, if you've been in the Congregational Church and you see that wonderful chandelier, again, that was originally in the 1830 building down the road in the cemetery. It was purchased by enlarging the church a bit and building even more pews to sell. The church is also the stewards of 2 communion cups that were made by Paul Revere. And we keep those actually in a safety deposit box, and they come out once or twice a year for communion. If you're really interested in seeing them, they will be out this coming Sunday for World Communion Sunday. And I think perhaps I'll leave you just with having heard about the native peoples who were here before us and thinking about generations ahead. We've been doing that a bit at First Congregational Church in the sense that we've been looking at our history because of this wonderful 300th celebration and thinking about the future. And one of the wonderful antiques that we have is the communion table, the altar table from 200 years ago. So not only was it was in the second meeting house, the third at the cemetery, and then the one moved here. And somehow it has found its way into our parlor and has been taken well care of. But just last Sunday, we restored that communion table to its rightful place in the sanctuary. And we again worship on Sunday morning on the same communion altar table that our ancestors 200 years ago were using, which is very exciting as we move into the future. So a little bit about First Congregational Church and our different locales.
Well, Joe, I was going to say nice things about the Congregationalists.
Yeah, well.
Not so much anymore. Methodism came to Chatham in about 1799. Now, the followers were first affiliated with the Harwich Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which was the name of the Methodist Church then. In 1808, their first structure was a chapel that was built for their use by Richard Gould, and that sat at the intersection of School and Water Streets. And it was built to shorten the trip to Harwich during the winter and obviously on inclement days. So that fellowship finally received certification as a Chatham Society in 1816, and through the hospitality of then the town fathers, they were allowed to use the town meeting house, which was located at Queen Anne and George Ryder Roads. The state-sanctioned Congregationalists were already using the building, but Chatham, in its history, has always been open to multiple faith stances, and they had no fear of the emerging religious communities and expressions in their midst. In the years to come, the Methodist community built 2 houses of worship within what is now Seaside Cemetery. And then they built a 3rd structure on the site of the current Medical Associates building on Crowell Road before constructing the current building that we have now in 1849 at the corner of Main and Cross Streets. So the town of Chatham bought the Crowell Road structure in 1851 and used it as a town hall. Then when the community built a new town hall on what is currently the site where we are today, the community building, the Crowell Road structure was moved to Old Harbor Road and was adjacent to the present Melson Webster Kinlan Grover Real Estate Office. And there it was modified and used for an almshouse. Now this particular structure is the one that you saw on the postcard dated 1916 that had been moved. Several changes have taken place in the sanctuary building over its 163-year history, and you saw several of those of the sanctuary, 3 major renovations until the most current one. One of the most exciting additions to the sanctuary were the Tiffany-style art glass windows that you see today in our sanctuary, a very rare Belgian drapery glass, and we have a wonderful complete write-up on those that we leave out for visitors. The windows really are priceless, and they are extraordinary examples of glassmaking of the time. 2 additions have been placed on the original building. Again, you saw the original in many postcards. And one was in 1964, and the latest in 1996, excuse me, adding education space and a connector between the 2 buildings. Music has always been very important to us. And in some of the photographs, you saw the 2nd organ in the sanctuary. Bill, I don't think we have a photo of the first, do we? The original organ?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, do we? Okay.
Yeah.
But the organ, the organ that you saw in here was the 2nd organ. And most of you know now that one of the great additions to our sanctuary this past year was the NOAC organ that was installed in 2010 and was a private gift to our congregation, and several of our musicians in the area have enjoyed playing that in the past year. The United Methodist Church came into reality in 1952 with the merger of the Evangelical United Brethren and the Methodist Episcopal Church. At that point in time, the Methodist Church became the 2nd largest denomination in America. We like to think that we have always had a very strong social outreach and try to be generous and active in our local opportunities, and hopefully have always had a very, very strong ecumenical outreach within our collegial congregations. We have always been a welcome expression of the Christian faith in Chatham, and we try consistently to be a positive force in the life of the Chatham community. I think probably one of the things that I have enjoyed most as the newest pastor in town is just to have this incredible history of the town clock that lives in our tower. And that town clock has kind of gone back and forth, and it belongs to the town again. Originally belonged to the church and back to the town. And one of the really, really fun things right after I got here was the using a trust fund that was developed in donations from the community as well as the church. we were able to renovate the works of the clock, actually replace them with electronic works. As Joe has already called out, when their bell was silenced, our town clock was silenced for quite a while when the works seized up. And so those works have now been replaced by an electronic mechanism. And at the same point in time, our bell was refurbished with an electronic striker, if you will, and now the bell actually rings on time. Something that I was told very clearly, that if it doesn't, climb the tower quickly. Well, the good news is don't have to do that anymore. The works are all downstairs. So that's the good news. And then most recently, Florence Selden had an opportunity to be with us when we dedicated, as a memorial to Claude Lumpkin, the lighting of the clock faces on the clock tower, and that was a great gift last fall. So the clock tower, for me, continues as a testimony for the United Methodist presence and our long history of helping people find their way here to Chatham. Thank you.
When you saw the pictures of the Unitarian Universalist meeting house, our church is the church without a steeple. The denomination now known as Unitarian Universalism began as two separate denominations which consolidated in 1961. Both Unitarianism and Universalism arose in New England in the late 18th century as reactions to Calvinism. Universalism was based on universal salvation, the idea that a loving God would not condemn any of his children to eternal damnation, and was popular among rural and working class folk, and was its own denomination from early on. Unitarianism arose as a style of thinking within New England Congregationalism and was a religion of urban elites. It did not become a separate denomination until 1825. There was never a Unitarian church in Chatham, to the best of my knowledge, but a Universalist church was founded here in the 1820s. I have a theory about it. The period from 1820 to 1830 is known in Unitarian history as a period of the Unitarian controversy. The churches of the standing order, that is to say the system of publicly supported churches that the Puritans originally set up, was still being publicly supported by 1820 because the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which forbade established religions, applied only to the federal government. The churches of the standing order, which mostly had the name of First Parish on them, had a dual form of organization. There was the parish, which consisted of voting age males in the vicinity, and then there was this church, a smaller body within the parish, consisting of those who passed the religious test that were considered worthy to take Holy Communion. Often at a time of ministerial transition, the parish would want to call a minister inclined to the new liberal thinking coming out of Harvard, and the church would want to call a minister of a more orthodox character. Where the liberal faction won these battles back in the 1820s, the First Parish Church on the Green today will have the name Unitarian Universalist. Where the Orthodox faction won, the First Parish today will be the United Church of Christ. So I don't know that such a controversy happened here, and we probably don't have the records to ever settle the question one way or the other. But if there had been such a controversy in the Congregational Church here, the Orthodox clearly did retain control. And whether this left some of the liberals at loose ends, there were definitely some free-range liberals in Chatham by 1822, for that is the year that the Universalist Church was found. It was located in what is now the People's Cemetery, which was bounded by Crowell and Stepping Stones roads. That cemetery was originally called the Universalist Cemetery. That building served the church until 1850, when a second meeting house was built. The second building was destroyed by fire in 1878, and the third and final building was built in 1879. It was that building, third building, which was sold to the Episcopal Church in 1961, right? 61. And much renovated, is known today as St. Christopher's. Right after that building was completed in 1879, a hurricane struck Chatham. But the new Universalist building was spared, which the parishioners took as a sign of God's favor. They called it the church that the hurricane built. Universalism's message that there was no hell had a certain appeal early in the 19th century, when other Christian faiths emphasized the fear of eternal damnation. But as that century wore on, a lot of mainstream Protestants Protestantism started de-emphasizing hell, and this in turn diluted the unique appeal of universalism. The heyday of the Chatham Church appears to have been about its 75th anniversary in 1897, when Charles Nickerson, the son of longtime member Captain Zebra Nickerson, was ordained as minister. By 1905, however, the church had ceased year-round operations, was open for services in the summer only, and had supply preachers. In September of 1944, as you saw in the slide in there, a hurricane swept through, and this time it did not spare the Universalist Church. It toppled the steeple and did other extensive damage. The small year-round congregation called a meeting to decide what to do, and they considered selling it to the town or merging it with other churches. In the end, they decided to raise money for repairs, and they opened a year later on a full-time basis with a new settled minister. They must have found a real angel. However, after a surge, membership again started to decline, and within a decade, the Universalist Church sold its building to the Episcopal Diocese and ceased operations. About the time the Universalist Church here was closing up, the national denomination was concluding negotiations for a consolidation of the Universalists with the Unitarians, which took place, as I said, in 1961. The new denomination was called Unitarian Universalist, or UU for short. Remember that I said that Unitarianism arose as liberal thinking within the standing order, the system of congregational churches established by the Puritans. One standing order church near to Chatham was First Parish in Brewster, and that had gone Unitarian sometime in the mid-19th century. By the late 1970s, First Parish Brewster was about to close its doors. It had fallen on hard times. And it was debating whether to close when a breath of fresh air arrived in the form of a minister named Jim Robinson, no relation to me. The happy coincidence with a very energetic minister and a demographic influx of new families into the town made the church grow like topsy. Jim Robinson, on the other hand, had never wanted to be a large church minister, so he set about looking for ways to siphon off some of this growth. He encouraged his Chatham and Harwich parishioners to form a fellowship, and they did so, meeting at the Chatham Creative Arts Center from 1986 to 1996. There was a lay preacher in the Brewster Church named Peter Fleck, an extraordinary individual who was a Dutch Jewish refugee from the Nazis, and a financier who got very heavily involved in Unitarian Universalism at all levels, and was eventually ordained by the Brewster Church. Peter agreed to preach once a month at the Chatham UU Fellowship, which he did for the 10 years until his death in 1995. Thereafter, his widow, Ruth, generously endowed the fellowship with enough money to hire a full-time minister for a year, and at almost the same time, the Christian Science building on Main Street came up for sale. But there were only 35 members of the fellowship. How would they buy the building? With some help from Ruth Fleck and from First Parish Brewster, they took a deep breath and found the money somehow. They call it the Miracle on Main Street, right up there with the loaves and fishes. On a bright October Sunday in 1996, they wheeled the pulpit up Crowell Road from the Creative Arts Center behind a bagpiper, and all processed to their new church home. By the end of that first Sunday, the membership had doubled, and it reached 200 by the end of the year. Ed Hardy served the congregation from that day until he left in 2005, and after 2 interim ministers, they called me, and I came in August of 2008, the second settled minister, and I'm now in my 5th year at the Meeting House. Now, we obviously don't have information about the churches that haven't survived around here. Supposedly the Masonic Lodge was at one time a Baptist church, and we haven't had much luck in getting the ministers at the west end of town to come into this history. So we hope to supplement it at some point in the future. But I would like to say a little note about Christian Science, because Virginia Gourdine, a Christian Science practitioner, has been meeting with the Clergy Association. The Christian Science religion was founded by Mary Baker Eddy, who lived from 1821 to 1910. In 1885, a Chatham resident, and this information comes from the dedication leaflet for the building we presently occupy. In 1885, a Chatham resident was healed of a supposedly incurable condition, and this aroused interest and resulted in a small group of practitioners meeting in people's homes. But in 1946, a society had been formed which met at the Masonic Hall and then in the Universalist Church. They were granted full church status by the Mother Church in Boston in 1952. The society had purchased a building site in 1947, but it was not until 1957 that funds were sufficient to hire an architect. Ground was broken in March of 1958. The rules of the Mother Church held that a Christian Science building cannot be dedicated until the property is free of debt. And so the building completed in 1958 was not dedicated until 1964, when bequest made possible the paying off of the building loan. The church occupied the building until 1995, when the Chatham Christian Science congregation was consolidated with the Harwich Christian Science Church, and the building was sold to the Unitarian Universalists, who occupy it today. The Christian Scientists still maintain a reading room on Main Street next to St. Christopher's Episcopal Church, next to their old haunts in the Universalist Church, that is to say. And speaking of St. Christopher's.
Well, there was no Episcopal Church in Chatham until 1961, but there were Episcopalians here. And a group of them began to gather in 1960, and is a way to further the mission of the church in Chatham. And they met in the home of Mrs. Charles Shepherd, Winifred Shepherd, and were supported by Archdeacon Louis Sheen and the Reverend James Babcock, who at that point was rector of the Church of the Holy Spirit in Orleans. And then they moved from that home service area, supported by them, to the American Legion Hall. And Lenten services were held in the American Legion Hall in 1961. And then in the summer of 1961, the services were held in the old Universalist Church. They were renting that property at that point. And then later in the year, it was purchased through the work of Charles Shepherd and Warren Sampson for $20,000. And by the way, Warren Sampson is my uncle. And he has just returned back to Chatham and is now attending St. Christopher's again. And they bought that free and clear. There was no mortgage. For $20,000, they bought the building. And then later, they also then, in June of 1962, Anson Stokes, who was the Bishop of Massachusetts, appointed a committee to organize a mission. And that committee consisted of Mr. Charles Shepherd, Mr. France Vota, and Mrs. Florence Douglas, Mrs. Winifred Shepherd, Mr. George Willett, and Mr. J. Warren Sampson. And this committee then worked towards moving them to become a full mission of the Episcopal Church. And at the same time, they purchased a vicarage on 115 Old Harbor Road, and I've driven by that this past week. It's the wonderful building that's sitting across the street from the Roman Catholic Church parking lot. It's beautiful. It sits back there. If you go by too fast, you're going to miss it, but it's a beautiful old building. And at that point, they called the Reverend W. Gilbert Dent to be their vicar, because you're only a vicar when you're a part of when you have a mission in the Episcopal Church. And they spent the next months renovating the Universalist Church and reconditioning the 115-year-old Stevens Tracker organ that is still the organ in the church there. In May of 1963, St. Christopher's became the official organized mission of the Episcopal Church, and it had a budget then of $15,000, 390 communicants. So they did pretty well. And over the next several years, they continued to renovate the building, and in 1967, St. Christopher's became a full parish. And Mr. Dent went from becoming the vicar to the very first rector. And Charles Shepherd was the first warden of the church. And in 1969, the Reverend Carl Carlozzi became the second rector of the church. And again, the church went under some more renovation at the time. And they also, there was you could sort of see it, I think, in a couple of those pictures, but there was an old gas station, sort of in the general area where the Christian Scientist house is right now. It was in that area there. And they purchased that gas station and demolished it, and turned that whole area and that part in the front of the church into a garden area, and that was under the direction of Mr. Sibley, Arthur Sibley. And they also, at the same time, about 1971, added to the building and created a rector's studio, study, a sacristy, a choir room, a parish office, and a new back entry. So all of that happened sort of in the undercroft, what we call the undercroft of the church. In 1972, that was when the gas station was demolished. And that's sort of at the same time those white picket fences showed up along the front street of Main Street, Chatham. But funnily enough, I looked at some of the old photos that we didn't have here that I got from the library, and there was a picket fence in front of the church way back. So they're not new, they're pretty old, and they make the front of the church look the way it did years ago. In 1976, the St. Christopher's Thrift and Gift Shop was opened, and it was originally not located in the church. It was in a rented house on Main Street, across the street from Drew's Bait Shop. So I had to find out where Drew's Bait Shop is. It's on 28, and it actually is in, I think the building that was now in the Monomoy Salvage. So there's still a Drew's shop that's up there up at Mayhill. But it's, yep, and that's where the original thrift and gift shop was. And in 1978, construction began on a new parish hall, the Sibley Chapel, the kitchen, and the bell tower. All of those things came about in 1978. And then at that point, the gift shop was moved into the undercroft. And all of this was then dedicated in 1979. In 1980, the windows, if you go into the church now, the memorial windows that you see along the sides of the church and both sides of the church were dedicated. And those were, they were dedicated by the Right Reverend Archie Crowley, who was a retired suffragan bishop from Michigan. And they were the work of the Leo Lubbers Studio of Montreal, Canada. And in, in 1980, Reverend Carlozzi resigned, and the third rector came, and that was Reverend Whitney Burr. And he assumed his duties in January of 1982. So there was a time period where we had an interim ministry at St. Christopher's. And then during Reverend Burr's years as rector, further improvements and renovations were undergone. You never are finished renovating. Sorry, you're never finished. And there was the memorial library, the choir room that was made became the library. The work was done in the cloisters, as you see at the front that's still there, and the bell tower. And then classrooms were added into an upper area of the parish hall, and a closet that had been the parish hall became a nursery and a Sunday school office. And I actually occupied one of those for a while when I first came to the church. And in 1989, plans for the memorial garden in the back were approved, and Willis Mills drew up the sketch for the plan that was approved by the town, while Jim Davis drew up schematics for the use of that space. In 2008, a memorial garden committee was formed and further landscaping was done. And it's a lovely green space that sits there in the middle of the town right next to our big parking lot. But it's a lovely place to come to, and it was always meant to be a place for contemplation and reflection, as well as a place for the ashes of loved ones to be buried. And I think one of my favorite things is last summer, there was some people, they were having a picnic out in the back there, just from off-site having a picnic, and that's what that space in the back is meant for. In 2001, Reverend Burr retired, and in May of 2003, the Reverend Brian McGurk became the fourth rector. And St. Christopher's had continued to grow, and part of his coming to St. Christopher's was, he said, you need to do some more work. Funny that, and you need to renovate. So they needed to renovate the church space itself, the classrooms, the offices, and the way you used to be able to get into the church, those of you that remember, you had to go up a series of steps to get into the sanctuary area, and that's how, if you were handicapped, you had to go up in there. And for a while they had this really one of those funny old things that took you up in a wheelchair. And if you were carrying a casket up, they carried that casket up those fairly steep steps to get in. So handicapped accessibility became one of the main things that was going to happen. And in 2004, an architect was engaged and plans were made and approved. And the first phase of that project was the moving of underground piping that was left there. And it was done in the fall of 2007. And St. Christopher's and the town worked together so that we would not disrupt the summertime. So that happened in 2007, and we held off our renovations to the church until the following fall of 2008. And part of what happened in that, we added 30 feet to the sanctuary, and that's what you could see when you saw that new picture. And the whole church was, its orientation of the altar was moved around, so that it is now at the side of the, on Main Street. And the window, the shape of the window that you see on Main Street that is now behind the altar, it was the same shape, but it's a new window. Let me see. And then all that time, because we had to empty out the church, everything was moved to the parish hall. All that new building that was done in 1979 became the worship space. The classrooms became offices. There was a nursery, and the music people were there, and Eileen and I shared another office that was for the Sunday school. And at that time, because all that was happening, the food pantry that was housed in the basement moved, and that moved to a building that was down across the street from Ocean State Job Lot. And at that point, the thrift shop and gift shop got a new location, which is still in. It's a lovely new location. It's right next door. It's very easy to get to it. So it's in the lower part of the building that will now become the Orpheum Theater up top. So we kind of share. I love the fact that we don't give things away. We renovate and we recycle and reuse buildings in this town. Our church was dedicated, the new sanctuary was dedicated December 20th of 2009 during a tremendous snowstorm. We almost thought about stopping the service, but we didn't. And we had, people just came, and the Right Reverend Barbara C. Harris, retired Bishop of Massachusetts, and the first female bishop in the Episcopal Church, came and presided over that dedication. And besides dedicating the new sanctuary, she dedicated the new altar. The new stained glass window that I told you about was designed by Lynn Hubby, whose studio is located outside of Boston, and it was put behind the altar in the spring of 2010. And all of that was under the guidance of David Garr, who, by the way, should be here, standing here instead of me. Most of the information that we have here is because of David and all the work that he did as our historian. And this new stained glass was dedicated in May of 2010. And since then, our new worship space has been used for concerts. There's a new monthly evensong and evening prayer cycle. Hyannis Sound, a male a cappella group, and Cape Harmony, a female a cappella group, continue to use the space in the summer for concerts. It's used for first night. The Chatham Food Pantry was brought back to St. Christopher's in the fall of 2011. And this past summer, we've begun to use the new entrance hall space as an art gallery for exhibitions. And the first one over the summertime had the subject of Noah and his ark. And right now there is a study now, lithographs by Marc Chagall with a biblical theme. And those are always open to the public to come in and look at and enjoy. And more exhibits are planned for the future, and all are welcome. And so we hope our space continues to be used and reused and recycled as it has been.
My apologies to Joe Matter. I took the nail out of order.
For any of you that are following this program closely, I am now in the number 7 spot, but I am not Reverend Gail Smith. It was kind of interesting when I spoke to Nancy about doing this. I decided I better do a little research, and one of the things that I discovered was that in 1606, a group of French explorers under the leadership of Samuel de Champlain sought shelter in the calm waters of Sage Harbor, where they camped for about 2 weeks. The French explorers were predominantly Roman Catholic and always had one or more priests, usually Jesuit missionaries, with them. As was their custom, they landed anywhere. Well, as was their custom, whenever they landed anywhere, they gathered for the celebration of the Mass in thanksgiving for a safe journey, probably near what we now know as the Old Mill Boatyard. Now, I was going to bring up the fact that the Catholic religious service was celebrated here about 50 years before the Nickersons arrived. However, Todd Kelly told us about the fact that the Wampanoags had been celebrating religious activities here since shortly after Adam and Eve. So I decided to pass on that. A little over 300 years passed after de Champlain visited Chatham until enough Catholics had settled in the Chatham area to justify the planning process for a parish in Chatham. In 1910, William Stang, the first bishop of the Diocese of Fall River, which now includes all of Bristol, Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket counties, assigned priests of the religious order of the Sacred Hearts of Jesus and Mary to come to Cape Cod to serve the needs of the growing number of Catholics. They chose Wellfleet as their base of operations and established a parish that included all of the towns from Provincetown to the Bass River. Quite a spread. 5 years later, in the summer of 1915, a non-Catholic Chatham summer resident offered her unoccupied bungalow for the celebration of Mass each Sunday morning at 6 a.m. During the winters, Masses were celebrated at the homes of Matthew Slavin and Benjamin Eldridge, the latter's home eventually becoming a Holy Redeemer's current rectory on Highland Avenue. Because of the swelling number of parishioners in Chatham, in November of 1915, ground was broken for Chatham's first Roman Catholic church. It was dedicated on Sunday, August 27, 1916, by Daniel Fiend to Diocese's second bishop. For the next 15 years, the church served as a mission, without a resident priest, and under the direction of the Sacred Heart Fathers Parish in Wellfleet. In 1931, Holy Trinity Parish was established in West Harwich, and then it took responsibility for the mission churches in Chatham and Brewster. For the next 21 years, priests from Holy Trinity served the Highland Avenue mission. Then in 1952, Sacred Heart priest John Brennan, who some of you may remember, was assigned to Holy Trinity with the responsibility for the Chatham mission. In 1954, the church's seating capacity was increased from about 150 to 400, and the Eldridge home at 57 Highland Avenue was purchased to be used as the parish rectory. Holy Redeemer became a standalone parish on April 24, 1955, and Father Brennan was named its first pastor. A little later, the parish purchased the house next door from the Doan, Beal, and Ain Funeral Home, and that was used for about 24 years as the religious education center for the children of the parish. The number of summer residents and visitors continued to grow in the 1950s and 60s, and it became obvious that more seating capacity was needed. So in 1963, Our Lady of Grace Chapel was opened on Meeting House Road in South Chatham. The chapel has a seating capacity of about 575 and often has standing room only during its 3 masses during the summer months. In 1980, a major fundraising program was launched to expand and renovate Holy Redeemer, which now has a seating capacity of about 560, with 6 classrooms being added in the basement for religious educational programs. At about that same time, the former Religious Education Center was sold. That's the former Don Beal and Ames funeral home. Several Sacred Hearts priests served as pastors following Father Brennan, including Father Paul Price, Daniel McCarthy, and William McClenahan. Seems like a bias toward the Irish there, doesn't it? Diocesan priest Father Jim Buckley was appointed pastor in 1988, and he was succeeded by Father John Paul Gallant in 2000 and by Father George Scales in 2007, our current pastor. I was ordained a permanent deacon in 1997 and have served the parish since then. Deacon Stephen Miniger was ordained in 2007 and was assigned to the parish in 2011. It has been slightly over 400 years since the first Catholic Mass was celebrated in what we now call Chatham, and the numbers of year-round and seasonal parishioners have grown exponentially over the years. On a typical summer weekend, about 3,000 worshipers attend our Masses. We thank and praise Almighty God for the gift of these year-round and seasonal parishioners, and we thank God for the retired priests who help us now with some of the 7 Masses celebrated every weekend during the summer. That's a quick look at the history of Holy Redeemer Parish. May God bless you, and may God bless the town of Chatham, not only in the year of its 300th anniversary, but always and in every way. Thank you.
We thought we'd finish this up with one of the most extraordinary representations of religion in the town of Chatham, the Stalneck murals. This is my cell phone pictures with the permission of the Atwood House of some of them, but you really need to go, if you haven't been to see them, go see them in their original setting, because Alice Stalneck painted these in the early 1930s, and they originally were in a barn. That's Alice Stalneck. Self-portrait, but they were in her barn, and then after her death, it went out to California, came back. Now, they now reside in the original barn, which was purchased and moved to the Atwood House. So you can see them as they were originally done. But they are her take on the town of Chatham through her particular religious lens of her life, her thought. There's a wonderful little leaflet at the Atwood House written by Debbie Ecker about this, about the whole thing. And I want to just read a quote. These murals show a cross-section of the United States of America, portraits of the people of the town, with Christ, the Spirit of God, predominating. He is the Christ of now, ever present in democracy. So she saw her religion as a way to democracy, and she did it by showing the ordinary, these are recognizable people of Chatham, of her era. They're depicted in a biblical setting. There's Jesus, who is a mechanic of Chatham, preaching from the boat. That's a direct story from Matthew. Now, the other wall shows pictures of people of Chatham in their occupations. of the various occupations of again, these are all recognizable individuals from Chatham of the time. But this is a peculiar display of the whole thing. Keep on going.
Okay. I think that's it.
Oh, we.
Yep.
No, it's.
No, oops. Oh, well.
Yeah, I think that's all I got.
Well, there's technical glitches then. I would encourage you all, oh, there's a couple more. Well, also, the other wall is a circle supper, which was a regular weekly feature, I believe, at the Congregational Church, and was important for feeding the people of Chatham during that Depression era. And the amazing thing is the baked beans, people would bring in quite ordinary food, nothing fancy, but they dressed to the nines for that occasion. It's a wonderfully evocative thing. This can not do justice to it. Let me recommend that you go out there to see it. We're going to